Okay. So the YouTube is set up. Unmuted, it's pinned. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen real quick to introduce everyone to the group that you haven't been here before, and then introduce Cory to the group. I don't know why it's not working. Okay, so this is the Agency and Responsibility Research Group. Today, we're going to have a talk by Cory Clark, who is going to give a talk called Don Corleone and the Rational Irrationality of Blame, which is one of the best titles I've ever heard. So that's amazing. She's off to a good start. The group, so we just started this last fall. The goal has been to have 3 of these talks per semester. This is the 5th talk so far. This has been a lot of fun for me, and I think others have enjoyed it. So I'm glad that we started doing these things. There'll be some roundtable discussions coming up. I have one that is not quite planned, but I have people who agree to participate, so we'll talk about that. There are a bunch of different things that I hope to be able to do with this group in this sort of online space. Upcoming events. So Dana Nelkin is going to give a talk on Thursday, the 28th at 7. There's a book symposium, the first thing I've scheduled for next fall, Freedom, Responsibility, and Context by Ann Whittle. This is Andre Bukharev helped me set this up. And Barbara Vetter will give commentary, and Richard Feldman. So we already have that one set in stone. Like I said, there's a roundtable discussion on free will and science that'll be hopefully sometime in the next few months with Al Mealy, Eddie Namias, Adina Roskis, and John Dylan Haynes. And then Kadri Vivellen and Manuel Vargas have also agreed to give talks next year, but I haven't set up any dates or times for those yet. So I'll keep everyone posted as the time draws near. Okay, so during the event, you will not be able to unmute yourselves. I was explaining to Cory, we have to do this to prevent Zoom bombers, but I will make a point of unblocking you as soon as the talk is over, so you have access to your own microphone. When the talk ends, if you have questions, please use the hand raise icon. This is important, and leave your hand raised until the speaker is finished answering your question. If you just post your hand and then remove it, you disappear from the speaker's view. And so it's easier for the speaker if you leave the hand up until he or she is done, in this case, she, with answering it. And if you had questions, you don't have time, we don't have time to answer them. If you add them to the chat, I'll make sure that Cory gets a copy of the chat. That's also true. I'll give her any point you want to add stuff to the chat that you don't have time to say. I'll be happy to send her the transcript after the talk, so at least she gets your feedback. So the recording will be posted on the ARRG homepage. It'll be on YouTube, but I'll post a link on the ARRG homepage so it's easy to find. And then those posts, if people want, you can continue discussing the talk there after the fact, because it is a blog. So the blog post could serve as a discussion thread if people want it. The speakers are welcome to participate in this, but they're not in any way expected to. I don't even ask them to. They're doing enough just volunteering to give us their time. So, but that is a function that people can take advantage of if they're interested. So the speaker's bio. So Cory Clark is the executive director. This is a truncated thing for the purpose of fitting it on the screen, but Cory Clark is the executive director and co-founder, along with Professor Philip Tetlock, of the Adversarial Collaboration Research Center at University of Pennsylvania, where she's also a visiting scholar in the Department of Psychology. Before that, she was an assistant professor of social psychology at Durham University in the UK. Among other things, her research has found that desires to blame and punish others others underlie belief in human free will, which I think is a very fascinating thing. The finding, I think, is very interesting. Augmenting this belief and attributing free will to harm doers serves as a justification that enables people to bring punitive harm upon their fellow human beings with minimal psychological distress. Okay, so that said, without further ado, let me get everything set up. Cory, I gotta unpeg me and peg you. Give me 1 second.
Oh, I don't want to do that first.
Okay, so
Okay,
it's all yours.
Now do I hit share screen and then?
Yes, you should be able just to share screen directly.
Okay, share screen. Okay. All right. Okay, am I good?
Awesome.
So you see just like my face in the slides? Okay.
Yep.
So you guys aren't blocking the view of the slides. Okay. That's just on my screen. All right. Thanks very much for coming, everyone, and thanks for having me. This is pretty fun. I've never given this exact talk before, so we'll see how it goes, which is a good thing because some of you have attended other talks of mine. So some of this will be repetition for a couple of you, but the whole thing will be new, the whole package together. And I'm actually going to kind of do it backwards. You know, typically you would set up the theory for whatever the research you're going to present is, but in my case, I really did actually sort of get into this research backward, where I started conducting a bunch of research, discovered this pattern that seems really consistent and applies across a variety of different contexts. And then only recently I've started to think a little bit more about what might be the theoretical reasons why people show these tendencies. So I'm going to dump a ton of research on you first, and then I'll go into the sort of new part, which is what I've only been thinking about recently. I'm really interested in your feedback on all of this because I wrote, I think, just one chapter on it so far. Haven't even written a real paper on it yet. So I'll be very interested in what everyone has to say about it. Anyway, so that's my caveat for this kind of bizarre talk I'm about to give. Oh, how do I advance? There we go. So in 1889, Nietzsche postulated that free will belief was kind of invented by humans as a justification for holding other people morally responsible and judging and punishing other people. Since around, I guess I can read part of this quote, "Today we no longer have any pity for the concept of free will. Wherever responsibilities are sought, it is usually the instinct of wanting to judge and punish, which is at work." Since around 2012-ish, I think I've conducted 27 studies that test this idea experimentally, looking at whether when people are experiencing heightened desires to blame and judge and punish other people, they increase their belief in free will. So the idea is that potentially punitive motives might partially underlie people's belief in free will. And so in these studies, what I tend to do is expose people to some kind of harmful behavior of another person, and then measure their desire to punish other people, as well as attributions of free will to the specific perpetrator that they're reading about, and their general belief in free will, so the extent to which humans have free will. So I'm just going to present from this first paper, my favorite study from this paper. My favorite because it was the most naturalistic. We had, I was a TA for a social psychology class with my graduate advisor, Pete Ditto, and 2 days after their midterm exam, we sent emails to the students, and they were divided up into different groups. So one group of students received an email saying, "We discovered a cheat sheet after the exam. One of your classmates cheated. You know, this is a serious issue. We want to discuss it. Please complete this attached survey to facilitate discussion." And then another condition, they received an email that simply said, "There's going to be a class activity in the next class. Please complete the attached survey to help facilitate that class activity." And then the survey that they were linked to in the email asked them how severely students who are caught cheating should be punished, and then also included the FAD plus, the free will belief subscale from the FAD plus. So how much do people have free will in general? And what we saw was that, so the white bars here are people who thought one of their classmates had cheated. We saw that people who believed one of their own classmates had cheated thought cheaters should be punished more severely than people who thought they were answering their survey as part of a class exercise. And they also reported stronger belief in human free will than people who were in the control condition. So just recently, about a couple of years ago, I think I did a meta-analysis of all of these kinds of studies. So the studies had to manipulate desires to punish, typically by exposing people to some kind of harmful behavior. And then they had to measure either attributions of free will to the particular actor in the situation or measure free will belief. And this included 27 studies. So these were mostly my studies, although actually now that I think about it, I think maybe 4 of them were conducted by Andrew Monroe and one of his students. Included about 8,100 participants from 4 different published papers. And here are the results for free will attribution. So these are R effect sizes on the x-axis. And these are broken down by what the control condition was. So when people were reading about a bad action relative to a slightly less bad action, we observed a small to non-existent effect. But when we're comparing harmful behaviors to helpful behaviors, that's what good is helpful. So bad to good behaviors or bad to neutral behaviors, we see sort of small to medium effect sizes where people attribute more free will to bad actors than similar good or neutral actors. In these cases, it's usually not always, but often you try to have the actor doing the exact same thing or something very similar, but it produces harmful or helpful or more neutral consequences. So we see this motivated attributions of free will belief or free will attributions of free will effect. And then this is the results for free will beliefs. And here I broke it down by different types of free will belief measures. And you can see that, again, these are our effect sizes. So across these different measures, we generally see a sort of positive effect where when people are exposed to another person's harmful behavior relative to a control condition, they believe more in free will across these different measures. This one is just a scientific evaluation of science that challenges the existence of free will. All of these other ones are just personality measures of free will belief. But in all cases, again, we see this sort of motivated free will belief effect. Okay, so in the past, actually this paper has been going on for a long time, but some of my colleagues and I thought that motivated free will beliefs might help partially explain political differences in free will belief, or why we see differences among liberals and conservatives in their sort of abstract belief in free will. One thing past research has shown pretty consistently is that political conservatives or people on the right, of course, we can debate about what that all means, but for the sake of this talk, let's say that people on the right or political conservatives are the same kind of people. They report stronger belief in free will, and we can see this is kind of reflected in a lot of their, stereotypical judgments where they tend to emphasize personal responsibility more than liberals. And there's some evidence that suggests that conservatives moralize more than liberals. This is a graph from one of the Moral Foundation's paper. They argue that conservatives have a sort of broader range of actions that are morally, or range of behaviors or types of behaviors that are morally significant to conservatives than liberals. My colleagues and I weren't 100% sold that this is true. So the first thing that we did was conduct a meta-analysis aiming to replicate this effect of conservative moralization. So this will make it easier for me. So here we have 5 studies, and you can see our sample sizes, our samples, and our measures of ideology here in the far right column. Not far right, semi-right column, you can see our measures of moralization. Some of these could be criticized for having political content in them, but not all of them. So we have a few that are politically neutral. My favorite among these are probably these bottom 2. So this second from the bottom one is the moral badness of 16 faces. These were just faces that were made up to fill the quadrants of high warmth and high competence, or low warmth, low competence, the 4 quadrants, 4 faces from each. And conservatives said these faces were more morally bad. And the bottom, moral badness of the 30 big 5 facets, this is literally just the 30 facets from the big 5, so a variety of personality characteristics. And conservatives said it was more wrong to have those characteristics on average. So whether we have this potentially political content or not, we see that conservatism is associated, or more right-wing ideology is associated with more moralization. So the tendency to see things as morally relevant, but also morally bad or wrong. So in this project, we wanted to see whether it wasn't that liberals and conservatives necessarily had these really concrete, or maybe not concrete, that they had these consistent differences in belief in free will, where conservatives view the world differently and human freedom differently, and they understand the causes of human behavior in a different way. But maybe it's that conservatives have stronger tendencies to moralize, that gives them stronger need to blame and punish other people in their lives. And this is what causes them to believe more in free will. And if this is the case, then we should see that there aren't consistent political differences in free will judgments, but rather political differences in free will judgments vary as a function of desiring to punish other people. So in the first study, we looked at it's kind of like a replication of conservative belief in free will, but we also sought to leverage what is often considered a flaw of the FAD free will scale, that it contains items that have face validity for free will belief. So things like people have complete control over the decisions they make, but then also ones that seem to actually measure blame or wanting to punish people for bad behavior. So things like criminals are totally responsible for the bad things they do, to see if conservatism was associated with these two independently. And this is what we found. So more right-wing ideology was associated with stronger belief in free will. It was also associated with stronger desires to blame people for bad behavior specifically. And I don't know why I put the mediation model up here, because I don't think people consider those valid anymore. But in any case, it's reported in the paper that this stronger desires to blame partially mediates the relationship between more political or more right-wing ideology and stronger belief in free will. Okay, so now I'm going to power through a bunch of studies, but bear with me because they all show a very similar pattern. But I'm going to go fast. If you have questions about the details of them, you can ask me about it. Or I also put the QR codes up here if you want to just scan the paper and check it out on your phone while I'm talking. Okay, so in this first study, we wanted to test more experimentally whether political differences in free will belief were more associated with desires to punish. So in this study, we had participants read about three positive outcomes. So getting into an elite university, financial success, or winning a Grammy, or three negative outcomes, which were drug addiction, homelessness, or gang violence. And then we had participants rate how much responsibility, control, and free will people have for these different outcomes. If conservatives just generally believe more in free will and they tend to see people as more free or more responsible for the outcomes in their lives, we should see that they attribute more free will to all kinds of actions. But if part of the reason they believe more in free will is because they want to punish people for bad actions, we should see a stronger relationship between conservatism and free will judgments regarding bad outcomes. And we saw something like this. So there was a positive association between more conservatism and free will judgments for both the good and the bad outcomes, but this relationship was stronger for negative outcomes than positive outcomes. Then we wanted to test whether we could essentially eliminate any association between political ideology and free will judgments by morally matching a set of behaviors. So we conducted a pretest and identified 20 actions that liberals and conservatives found equally morally wrong. And these were within 4 types of behaviors. So we had morally good behaviors, which included things like volunteering in a soup kitchen, morally bad behaviors, which included things like spreading malicious gossip, non-moral good behaviors, such as making a successful financial investment, and non-moral bad behaviors, such as failing a college exam. So after we identified these 20 actions that liberals and conservatives viewed as similarly wrong, we had another set of participants rate how much control, responsibility, free will, free choice, and capacity to have made other choices people have over the different behaviors, and report their general belief in free will. And we again found that conservatism was associated with stronger belief in free will in general, but there was no association between political ideology and attributions of free will on these morally matched items. We then wanted to see if we could flip the relationship and see if liberals would ascribe more free will for actions that they perceive as more morally wrong. So we pre-tested a bunch of behaviors to find items that liberals perceive as more morally wrong, and we found 5 of these. To give 2 examples, one was wearing cosmetics that have been tested on animals, and another was, upon learning that a classmate was gay, immediately offering to pray for the student. And then we took these 5 actions and ran them on another set of participants and had participants attribute free will to these actions as before, and also report their general belief in free will. And we again found conservatism was associated with stronger belief in free will in general, but it was associated with lower attributions of free will for this specific set of items where conservatives found the behaviors less morally wrong than liberals. We then wanted to do a study where we wanted to find items that conservatives find the behaviors more morally wrong and a set of items that were morally matched. And I believe, again, we had 5 of each. So this, an example of items that conservatives find morally wrong was breaking an abstinence until marriage vow. A politically neutral one was smoking in a non-smoking section. So we then had, we ran 2 studies where we had participants evaluate how much free will people have over these outcomes. And in study 6A and 6B, we saw the same general patterns. So conservatism and free will belief were positively associated in both studies. For items that conservatives find more morally wrong, conservatism is associated with stronger or higher attributions of free will in both studies. And then when we're evaluating items that are morally matched among liberals and conservatives, there's no association between conservatism and attributions of free will in either study. However, none of these studies can help us know the causal order, because even though we're pre-testing these items to figure out whether they're viewed as more morally wrong and then measuring attributions of free will, it might be that we were sort of inadvertently also pre-testing free will judgments. And so what you have instead is liberals and conservatives view certain actions as more or less free, or that people have more control over them. And that's what causes the differences in morality. So in the final set of studies, we really wanted to isolate the causal order, that it really is these differences in desiring to punish that cause these political differences in free will judgments. So we tried to test this by manipulating the agent and target of a set of actions. So for example, one of them was they read about a either right-wing or left-wing journalist who released a sex scandal of a politician who was either a Republican or a Democrat. The journalist then learns that their source was unreliable and this person's lied before, and they don't retract the story. So it's either a right-wing journalist harming a Democrat politician or a left-wing journalist harming a Republican politician. The idea being that in this set of studies, people were evaluating the exact same behavior, but their desires to punish should still be different, because people should have stronger desires to punish an out-group member who harms an in-group member than vice versa. So we ran this study 4 times. Here are the graphs for 2 of the studies. We saw similar patterns in studies 1, 2, and 4 in, I think this is, I know the one on the right is from study 4. I forget if this one on the left is from study 1 or 2. In study 3, we didn't see an interaction, and we thought it might be because we ran the study from midnight to 6 a.m. for some reason. Don't know why we did that. But anyway, this is why we decided to run a study 4. And then we ran a meta-analysis of the 4 studies, and we saw a small but significant interaction such that as participants were more politically conservative, they attributed more free will to the left-wing agent who committed an infraction against a conservative target, and we observed the opposite for liberals. So we think what these results show is that free will judgments tend to vary as punitive desires vary. So it might not be that even though conservatives consistently report that they believe more in free will, it might not be some totally coherent, different perspective of how the world works. And rather, they have different desires to punish, and this causes them to believe more in free will or to report that they believe more in free will. I can't think of any way to directly test this because you can't manipulate the fact that conservatives moralize more in their lives, I don't think. But I do think it's consistent with the possibility that perhaps the reason conservatives report stronger belief in free will is because they moralize more in their lives and so have a greater need to see people as morally responsible so they can justifiably blame and punish other people. Okay, so in a little bit earlier work, I explored potential function of these motivated attributions of free will and motivated beliefs in free will, and tested whether free will belief really serves as a justification for people's punitive desires. So people have these contrary impulses when it comes to harming another person. People are generally averse to harming people, particularly for no reason if it's an innocent person. But people are also very punitive and willing to harm other people when they're getting revenge or retaliating against someone. So people have to kind of find a way to reconcile these two and overcome their harm aversion when they're desiring to punish other people. And research has also shown that whereas punishment is sort of socially helpful, it deters bad behavior in other people, it can be psychologically harmful. So people, even though they'll often happily punish another person, they sometimes seem to suffer sort of psychological consequences from being punitive toward other people. So I wanted to test the hypothesis that free will, ascribing free will to an actor might be one way we can justify to ourselves and to other people that harming this person is fair and justified because they deserve it. So in this study, I had participants, I'm only going to report one study from this paper as well. In this study, I had participants read about either a neutral behavior, which was taking the aluminum cans out of someone's recycling bin, or a harmful behavior, which was robbing a home and stealing all of their valuables. And then participants attributed free will to the perpetrator on these items. To what extent was the behavior freely chosen? Could they have made other choices? And did they have free will? And then participants read one of three arguments. So there was an anti-free will argument and a pro-free will argument that both provided sort of scientific arguments either against or for the existence of free will. And then in this third condition, participants read an argument that tried to justify people's punitive desires, but in the absence of free will. So it said something like, punishment is irrelevant to the question of whether people have free will or not. Punishment is justified on the grounds that it deters bad behavior. We should punish people because it helps, social groups cooperate better. Something along those lines. But the point of this was really to say, it is justified to punish people, even if people don't have free will. And then they attributed free will to the perpetrator again and completed the state trait anxiety inventory, which is just a short measure of how much anxiety they're experiencing. And the hypothesis was that when people were desiring to punish other people, they would experience higher levels of anxiety, but particularly when their free will beliefs were undermined by this anti-free will argument, and not when their desires to punish were justified either with this pro-free will argument or the argument that said punishment is justified on the grounds of deterrence. So these first set of results are the results just for free will attributions. So what we saw was in the pro-free will argument condition, people increased their belief in free will. In the anti-free will argument, or not belief, sorry, attributions of free will. In the anti-free will argument condition, they reduced their attributions of free will. And what I found interesting was that in the punish for deterrence argument condition, they also reduced their attributions of free will. So when we told participants that their desires to punish, or rather the desire to punish, is justified regardless of whether free will exists or not, they seem to not see this person as free, seeming to imply to me that they had less need to attribute free will to this perpetrator to justify their desire to punish, because their desire to punish was already justified by this deterrence argument. And then these are the results for anxiety. So as predicted in the anti-free will argument condition, we saw that people were experiencing higher levels of anxiety in the harmful condition relative to the neutral condition, whereas we didn't observe this effect in the pro-free will argument condition or the punish for deterrence argument condition. So what we think this suggests is that free will belief might help alleviate punitive distress, specifically by serving as a justification for people's punitive desires. I used to think this was really internal, and that maybe people had an internal conflict about whether their harm was, like harming another person, was justified. But now I've come to think of it as probably more social, and it's about persuading other people that the punishment is justified. So if I can convince others that this person deserves punishment because they were completely free, they intended this thing, they could have not done it, they had control over the situation and did it anyway, then I can punish this person that I want to punish and not suffer social consequences because I am viewed as justified in my behavior by other people. Okay, so now the question you've all been probably thinking about, where does the Godfather come into all of this? And this is where I get into the sort of post hoc theorizing about why I think I find these results. And although this is sort of the theoretical part, it was really sort of inspired by this quote from The Godfather. I'm a superstitious man, and if some unlucky accident should befall Michael, if he is to be shot in the head by a police officer, or be found hung dead in a jail cell, or if he should be struck by a bolt of lightning, then I'm going to blame some of the people in this room, and then I do not forgive. So what he's signaling here is that he is vengeful and that even if an obvious accident should occur where nobody was responsible, he's holding someone responsible. So why would he do this? I think the reason he would do this is because it would make people not want to cross him. It would make people work really hard not to piss him off. And this got me thinking about error management theory. Error management theory is an evolutionary theory about how cognitive biases would evolve in human psychology when you have asymmetric costs for false negative and false positive errors. So error management theory argues that, this thing keeps getting in my way. Error management theory argues that when false positives and false negatives were asymmetrically costly in terms of fitness, then humans should have evolved a bias toward preferring the less costly error. So the example from the very first paper that forwarded error management theory, the example they provided was men have a tendency to overestimate women's sexual interest in them. The argument being that if a man assumes a woman is sexually interested in him and makes a move and she rejects him, he's making a false positive error. It's a little bit embarrassing. If he assumes a woman's not sexually interested in him and doesn't make a move, but she is, he misses out on a successful mating opportunity. Missing out on a successful mating opportunity is costlier than embarrassment. So men have evolved a bias toward overestimating women's sexual interest. Maybe a more intuitive example would be, if you're walking in the woods at night by yourself, I don't know if people do that, but let's imagine that you were, and you hear like a branch snap, your instinct is going to be something's after me. And you're going to be wrong most of the time. But because elevating your defenses temporarily and, being alert because someone might be after you is not particularly costly, even when there is no predator. The opposite error, assuming, it was probably just a squirrel or the wind. If you're wrong and there really is a predator after you, then you're dead. So people have a bias toward assuming there is danger when there isn't danger, rather than missing out on danger that actually is there. In the context of what I am calling pro-blame bias, I think that perhaps people have these pro-blame biases because having a reputation as a harsh punisher is better than having a reputation as a pushover. So in this case, the false negative error would be not holding a person morally responsible who actually was morally responsible, and that would signal to that person and other people that you're exploitable and that people can take advantage of you. The false positive error would be holding someone who wasn't morally responsible. I put here that it signals that you're a remorseless badass, but it's probably not 100% good. Being viewed as excessively punitive would not be good for your reputation. It would intimidate other people away from harming you, though, which actually could be potentially beneficial. So the false negative error is really bad. The false positive error is maybe a little bit good and a little bit bad. The important caveat to this, and not all, but probably most cognitive biases that people demonstrate consistently, is that these things tend to happen in ambiguous cases. So like a branch and the snapping in the woods, you don't really know what the cause is. Hard to read the signals of a woman when you're talking to her at a bar. Similarly, it's often difficult to know what a person's intentions were, what a person's circumstances were when they committed some action that caused harm. We should see this pro-blame bias, particularly in cases that are ambiguous and you can't actually know the person's intentions or the circumstances surrounding the event. So you wouldn't see this for something like, you know, a person was driving and they had a heart attack and then they swerved and hit a pedestrian. You wouldn't see a pro-blame bias there because it's obvious the person didn't mean to do it. They were suffering a heart attack. You would see a pro-blame bias when it comes to more, I think, probably typical moral infractions where it's really difficult to know what the person's motives were and whether something happened on accident or on purpose. So this theory predicts that people should have a bias toward ascribing responsibility for harmful actions. I thought through, and I'll be interested to hear what you guys think about this, the potential asymmetry for false positives and false negatives regarding positive and neutral behaviors. For neutral behaviors, I don't think there's any obvious asymmetry, holding someone responsible or not holding someone responsible for something that no one really cares about because it's neutral. I don't think really has costs much in either direction. For false positives and negatives regarding positive behaviors, I do think that there could be a little something there. If you didn't give someone, for example, praise for doing something morally good that they should have been praised for, they might be less likely to do that good thing in the future. So that's a little bit costly. If you did give someone praise when they didn't deserve it, that costs you a little something. You're wasting your praise, I suppose. Maybe you're cheapening your praise. That's a little costly. I don't know that there's any obvious asymmetry, though. So I think we should particularly see that this bias exists in harmful behaviors, that when other people cause harm, we should be more likely to assume that they're responsible than when a similar person who performs a similar behavior causes neutral or positive consequences. And so I kind of thought through some of what the research that I've conducted and some of you have conducted. Does it explain some of these findings? And I think it might. So people ascribe more intentionality, causal control, free will, et cetera, every responsibility attribution to people who cause harmful consequences than to similarly situated people who cause neutral or helpful consequences, sometimes even when we're talking about the exact same behavior and the consequences just differ. We observe, and I'm calling these moral responsibility maintenance biases. These are what appears to be people trying to uphold the existence of moral responsibility. We see these when harms are directed toward the self or good others more than when they're directed toward bad others, in concrete rather than abstract cases, and in their own social worlds rather than other social worlds. In all of these cases, the false negatives are costlier. It's costlier if it's directed toward you because you don't want people harming you in the future. It's costlier when you're considering concrete cases rather than thinking about things in the abstract. And it's costlier when it's happening in your own world where it's actually socially significant to something that could happen to you than in other worlds. I also think it might explain why some of the most famous cases of this kind of research, for example, the side effect, and other examples where we're really talking about the outcome and not the behavior itself. The outcome was harmful, but the behavior was sort of neutral. A lot of these are ambiguous cases where people really couldn't evaluate the intentions of the person, or rather the intentions of the person are difficult to evaluate. We would in general see these kind of motivated attributions of responsibility. They should be more easy to study and find when you're looking at something that's potentially ambiguous. The reason for this, we think, is that you generally see biases in the ambiguous zone because there's more flexibility in how you interpret things, and it makes them kind of easier to get away with because other people can't call you out. They don't know what the reason is either. So I do think the false positive error, which would be accusing someone of intentionally, let's go with intention because it's easy, rather than free will, which I think is a little bit, it's hard to know what people mean when they say that. if you said someone intended something harmful when they clearly didn't, that could create reputational costs for you. So in a very clear case, you shouldn't see these pro-blame biases. But when it's ambiguous enough that other people wouldn't know, it makes sense for you to assume that that person intended it, because that should deter other people from purposefully screwing you over in the future. And you should be able to get away with it because nobody really knows if you're going overboard and assuming there was intention there when there wasn't. Okay. And this is my hottest take of the talk. I don't know if I believe it, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Is the existence of free will the ultimate ambiguous moral judgment? We are not in a place where we can fully comprehend all of the causes of human behavior. People have been disagreeing about free will for a really long time, and I suspect they will continue to disagree for a very long time. And so people should assume people have free will, especially when contemplating harmful actions, and assume that humans have free will because no one knows for sure. And believing in it allows us to punish other people justifiably without suffering social consequences because it's justifiable. So potentially, one reason people continue to believe in free will and seem really reluctant to give it up is because it is pretty much unknown and mysterious, and people can't really accuse you of, committing a moral infraction yourself when you assert other people have it and therefore should be held morally responsible. Okay, so why is this the irrational irrationality of pro-blame bias? The irrational component is that if we were able to perfectly assess how much freedom and control and intentionality, culpability, responsibility people had, and we did this in a really consistent way, we wouldn't see these biases. People would, in general, assert that people are a little bit less responsible than they are, especially when we compare them to less emotionally charged cases like neutral behaviors or positive behaviors. But it is rational in the sense that it's evolutionarily rational, and having this bias might be useful for promoting one's own fitness and making sure that one does not become the target of other people's harmful behavior. So even though we might not call it rational from, the standards of, I guess, being like fully consistent in your reasoning, we would call it rational in the sense that it is better for you to have this particular bias, or at least throughout evolutionary history, it would be better for people to have this particular bias, and that's probably why they have it. That is all. I guess I should stop share. Yeah.
Okay, let me unmute everybody, or actually, this is not going to unmute you. This is going to make it possible for you to unmute yourself. Cory, that was amazing. I'm a fan of this research.
Thank
so
you.
You're getting nothing but praise out of me. So let's see what everybody else has to say. Actually, let me unpin myself, so I'm not the only person sitting in the upper corner.
And feel free to bring on the criticism, because as I've said, I'm like, still working on these ideas, and so it's, in progress.
Okay. So everyone should be pinned. So Randy has a question. Let's start with that.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I don't know how old the idea of free will is. There's a really interesting paper by Suzanne Bobsian that places or locates the discovery of the problem of free will and determinism about 2,000 years ago. I heard an interesting talk earlier in the week by a theorist who said the idea is only about 300 years old. Michael Freda, in a book on the will, claims that Aristotle did not have a notion of the will, much less of free will. I don't know if these are correct, but if the idea of free will is not very old, then I wonder how, say, the dispositions to attribute free will could have been selected for by evolutionary processes, maybe social evolution over this period of several hundred years or a couple of thousand or so. But that seems too short a time span for the disposition to be influenced by biological evolution. So I wonder if the argument assumes that the idea is much, much older in human history than these theorists have suggested.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something I've thought a lot about too. I don't have strong views about when the idea of free will emerged. To me, motivated free will attributions aren't really about free will specifically. I view them as a class of motivated attributions of responsibility. And I think in people's minds, things like free will, intention, control, causal control, responsibility, blah, blah, these mean kind of the same thing to people. So I would say that this would have emerged whenever concepts of responsibility emerged. I assume that those have been around for a much longer time than free will. And I think potentially what you have is, and this is just one view of maybe when we would have started to care about free will, is that in societies that decide that something like free will is necessary to justify moral responsibility, those societies should cause people to be motivated to uphold it when they're desiring to punish other people. If a society had a different concept or construct or whatever that was the prerequisite for moral responsibility, that's what would be motivated. So I think it's not about free will specifically, it's more about responsibility in general. At least that's how I think about it, but I could be wrong.
Thanks.
Sorry, Greg, you're up.
Hi, Cory. That was a great talk. I guess I have two questions. I don't know if I could ask both. One actually is more just a helpful comment. It seems to fit both with Randy's question and your answer. So one of the things I was thinking with this pro-blame bias, that it's harsher to punish, it's better to have harsh punishment so you don't look like a pushover. And I was wondering if any work has been done on like non-weird societies, because one of the things I was thinking in this sort of just so kind of evolutionary account would be that, as you just suggested, it really has nothing to do with free will, right? Like this desire to punish, and it's biased to have more punitive punishment so you don't look like a pushover, would be very dominant in, say, honor cultures. And it's interesting that the talk is based around this quote by Don Corleone, whatever, from The Godfather. Because in his sense, it's a very honor culture kind of phenomena. And in fact, I think he threw in that quote, like a weather pattern would be enough. If something bad happened to Michael, he'd still hold them responsible. And it seems that in honor cultures, before we got to individualized responsibility, it didn't even matter who in the other group I held responsible, right? As long as I held someone in that other group responsible. And partly the reasoning was, as you indicate, for evolutionary purposes, in societies where there wasn't any strong third-party justice, I didn't want to look like a pushover. And so as long as I punished anyone harshly, it was sort of justification. It seems to me that the mitigated role that responsibility plays probably comes in at the point in the story where we moved from sort of honor culture or third-party kind of justice to individualized accounts where justice was sort of handed over to third-party enforcement. And we started to get the idea that individual responsibility had to play some role to track who deserved the punishment. And maybe in that case, it would seem then, just if I were thinking empirically, you would find this bias for harsher punishment to be even stronger prior to this evolution of individualized accounts of responsibility, stronger in honor cultures, but still present in our own kind of moral responsibility system, but mitigated because it's really just playing this kind of justificatory role, if that makes sense. So I would ask you if there's any empirical evidence for that. Let me just throw in my second thought, which is I love everything that you do, and I love all of this empirical stuff. And I'm with you all the way until the end in this new account that you give. And part of my main difference, I think, with you in the interpretive part is that you seem to think that there's a normative aspect to this free will being the ultimately ambiguous kind of moral judgment, whereas I see it as a more descriptive claim. Um, I think it's absolutely right. We have this kind of motivated reasoning. I think that maybe it happens for exactly the reasons you propose. What I would differ is that I don't think it's actually a good thing that we maintain this kind of account to justify our punitive desires via descriptions of free will, in part for reasons that you already indicate. They're not very reliable. They don't really track deservability in any kind of systematic way. They over ascribe them. We have a bias to ascribe more than to ascribe less. And there's all these good reasons to think if we cared about proportionality, all of that would be a really bad thing. So I think that where I would differ is you go normative and think that because it plays this role, it's a good thing and we should preserve it. Whereas I would say this is a very good descriptive account of the psychology behind free will and motivated reasoning about responsibility. But for me, it's more indicative of the failures of the traditional account that says what we're really doing is reasoning in the opposite direction. We're accurately ascribing control and reasons responsiveness and assessments about free will, and then we judge blame and responsibility in proportion to what we think the person really deserves. Your work suggests that that's not what's happening. And I think that since that's not what's happening, and that's what should be happening on a sort of proper account of moral responsibility, your work is more indicative of a problem for the current responsibility practices rather than a justification for their normative preservation. That we ought to
I think
preserve it.
you're making the normative claim. when
Well, I'm
I
making
say
the
it's,
negative normative claim, but I'm saying that the descriptive stuff is neutral. And the only
yeah,
reason I was thinking that there might be a reason to go the other way is for all the reasons that your work indicates, which is that it's not very accurate. We overascribe. We even have a bias to want to punish more just because it's self-protective. Better to have a false negative than a false positive. All of that seems to be that, to me, to indicate that desert is a very poor guide for assessing punishment, and desert is a very poor guide for assessing responsible judgments like blame. And so maybe that's a better indication for going my direction than your direction.
when I say the rational irrationality of blame, I'm not saying rational good, we should do it. What I mean is that it does make sense that people do it. And they may have good reasons for doing it, even if they're not aware of those reasons. I don't really think of anything I said as making a normative judgment that we should do this. I think, like you, do worry that people are excessively punitive, and I feel like people are getting worse even in recent years. So I wouldn't say this is a good thing that people do this. I would say it's an understandable thing, and that I think there are probably good reasons for it. So I would say I don't think I'm making a normative judgment, and if that's what it came off as, then that was my bad. I didn't mean to imply that. For the honor culture thing, I actually think that's really interesting, because one thing that's sort of been challenging when I think about this is that even though I claim that people care about upholding free will, and I think that they do, it's clear that people didn't always feel that way. And as you pointed out, there was a time when if somebody wronged you, you'd go kill their kid or something. Like you would get revenge on a completely different person to show that you were, a remorseless badass. So it's not like they cared about the free will of the person that they're killing to punish a different person. But yeah, I think you're exactly right that it's about signaling to other people, if you wrong me, I will get revenge. And you're right that and this gets to the normative question too. There's always the issue of the potential mismatch and what we would have evolved, how our brains would have evolved because of how things worked thousands of years ago when we didn't have reliable criminal justice systems that we've mostly said, when someone does something wrong, I'm not going to do anything. I'll let the government handle it. And it could be that pro-blame bias. Not only is it irrational in the sense that people are blaming people more than they should be, but it's even irrational in the sense that we have pretty good systems of regulating the worst kinds of immoral behavior. And the fact that people are still moralizing all of these things and calling people horrible names and doing bad things to people to get revenge is a huge mistake now, because it's not needed. So yeah, we definitely could be in a situation where these kinds of biases made more sense thousands of years ago than they do now. Yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Good. So Suki.
Hi, Cory. Thank you for the great talk. I had a general question. Do you think that some of your findings that you have are possibly moderated by the social status that someone has within a hierarchy? And also, kind of a little bit related, do you think that potentially there's a mediation happening with individuals who are presenting with, let's say, higher rates of dark triad traits? Like could potentially dark triads could be mediating that? And I guess the last question, and this is more of a broad question, how do you think that these findings would manifest themselves within the clinical population?
So I haven't measured any of those things myself, but they are interesting. So when you say social status moderated, do you mean in the how people blame other people or in who's doing the blaming?
I think both, actually. I think you can.
I have looked at studies, but I think these were just general punitiveness, and they weren't really good. I found mixed results about whether people are more punitive toward high or low status people. In one of them, I found people are more punitive toward high status people, but it was a financial transgression. It was like a person stole. So maybe they're like, you're especially greedy because you're already rich and you're stealing money. But I think it's possible that it could be. Social status gets complicated. I also had some studies a while back where I manipulated the race of the perpetrator. And I was thinking that people would attribute more free will to a Black juvenile than a white juvenile who committed like a violent act. But if I'm remembering correctly, I think I found the opposite, that they actually attributed less free will. And I didn't know what to make of that. I guess what I'm saying is it's probably true that these things are moderated by various characteristics of the perpetrator. And probably also the person delivering the punishment or making the responsibility judgment, but I don't have very good data on it. I don't even think I've broken this down by gender before. So there's a question. Are men or women more likely? Because I guess if you're trying to get a reputation as a remorseless badass, you might think that men do this more than women, because that would be more important probably for men than women. Someone should do that study. But to your questions, yeah, those are interesting, and I have no idea, but they would be interesting to look at.
Okay, so Eddie.
Hey, Cory, long time no see. This is all really fascinating stuff, and it just opens up so many potential things to test. So a lot of stuff that's already come up: cross-cultural differences, honor culture, gender differences, severity of the harms that are being caused should presumably be mediated by a lot of this. most of my actual question, Randy and Greg already brought up, but I'll put it in slightly different terms, which is, until you brought up the point about our general belief in free will maybe being an error management explanation for why maybe perhaps especially in modern religious weird cultures we have this concept of free will that's doing the work. Until you brought that up, though, what I wanted to say is everything that people are picking up on in their judgments, whether they're right or wrong descriptively, is compatibilist capacities about free will. And you even said like it's mostly intentionality and stuff. So one thing I just wanted to highlight is unless you're trying to say something about a general cultural phenomena of free will in some metaphysical libertarian sense, the whole theory depends on people being attuned to the degree to which people are being blamed erroneously in some cases for the degree to which they're controlling their actions or they're doing their actions intentionally or with malicious intent, etc. So as is typically the case, the compatibilist conditions for free will are the ones that are interesting psychologically and ones that we can measure varying degrees of both existence and belief. The other thing, so that's mostly just a comment, but it ties in with the stuff Randy and Greg were saying about the history of the concept and honor cultures. I mean, honor cultures are weird because they don't really care about whether people had free will to some extent when they're doing the blaming. And then so you can say whatever you want about that if you want, but then two quick questions. One about the methodology. One, if you can explain really quickly, why are you saying mediation analyses are out the door? I just didn't know that.
I wanted to hear that too.
Yeah. And two, and Thomas will want to hear the answer to this one too. When are you going to start using the free will index instead of FAT? And why haven't you? I mean, in all seriousness, because it is a better measure.
Oh, Eddie.
Okay, I will address that. Yeah, so for the compatibilism thing, my view, which I think you know, is that I think people have no idea what they mean when they say free will. And I think it's really just a way to assert people are responsible. I think they probably mean it both in the incompatibilist sense sometimes, in that if you chip away at the incompatibilist or the libertarian free will, that seems to bother them, but they also use it in perfectly compatibilist ways all the time too. I just don't think people will ever think of free will the way philosophers think of free will. So yeah, I mean, even though I look at free will, I really do think really what I'm talking about is responsibility. On the other questions, mediation out the door, maybe I'm like overreading the environment or something. But there have been a lot of criticisms of mediation in psychology recently. I don't know that we will do away with it altogether. I think people don't consider it useful for making any causal order things. Like, a lot of the time, if you put a mediator, IV, mediator, DV, and you swap the mediator and the DV, the results look pretty similar. And even if they don't, I don't know that it's particularly diagnostic that one's coming before the other.
But
So
is
when
there
I
something
say
better? Is there something better to replace it? More complicated modeling?
Structural equation modeling.
experimentation,
Structural equation model. What?
Experimentation.
Experimentation, right. Manipulating.
Unfortunately, is often not possible, but
Okay.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe I've had a lot of mixed reviews. I've had enough where people told me get rid of all the mediations that I'm like, maybe this is the direction we're headed. Maybe not. I do think people are still debating it, so we'll see how that goes. If psychology happens first before philosophy in terms of the methodological changes, then maybe you guys will start feeling that heat soon. But we'll see. If there's enough pushback, it might not spread. And on the free will inventory, instead of that, the only reason is that I'm trying to think, when is the last time I even ran one of these studies? that used a free will belief measure. I used them in my meta-analysis, which was 27 studies, but mostly they were ones that had already been done. And it was also in response to Andrew Monroe, who failed to replicate the free will belief effect, like I think 3 out of 4 times. And he used the full FAD plus, whereas I used the free will subscale of the FAD. And so I wanted to see, is that why he found different results? And indeed, I found a smaller effect for the full FAD. So that's why I continue to use it in that paper. So for no reason. And I will definitely consider using the free will inventory in future research.
Don't let Eddie make you feel bad.
I don't
So-
feel bad.
So I had a question about, so the error management part makes it sort of other oriented, because you're managing other people's impression of you.
Mhm.
And so it is a way of like protecting yourself, but it's protecting yourself by getting other people to view you in a certain way, right?
Mhm.
And it seems like surely that's part of what's going on. But it seems like there's this other thing that it ties to, I think, a way you've discussed this in the past before you used the error management piece. And I want to say it and then make sure that I remember that being part of what you have said in some of these papers, which is, so we are, you even had a slide in this talk about this, like we are averse to harming people for good evolutionary reasons. Like we don't like doing it. We're told not to do it. We shouldn't do it. Like everything, it puts us in a position not to do it. I mean, it's like the thing you do that will get you the most blame, isolation. Yet when people hurt
You
us,
just gave another explanation.
but like, yet when people hurt us, right? We hurt them back. And the hurting thing is something we're just pre-packaged not to be too comfortable with. But yeah, we got to do it. And then, so the way of, this is like the thing of like the guilt removal piece, that it reduces the amount of guilt I feel for harming somebody because they harm me. Yeah. But if I can make them like fully responsible in some robust sense for what they did, then I don't have to feel bad for harming them. They've like brought this upon themselves in a certain way. So it's like there's a natural squeamishness to harming others. And yet when we're in the position to punish them, we're sort of forced to choke that down and get past it. And then one way to do that is to like inflate their agency in ways that make us feel better about it. And that's not about sending a message to other people so much.
Mhm.
It's more about just me trying to internally be okay with, in some sense, what had to be done. I don't know if that makes sense, because I want to say it seems like I remember that being a kind of way that you had explained it, which is not incompatible with this way, by the way, because of course these are just two different things can be going on, and they both push, the pressure is in the same direction, so they're not even conflicting in that way either. But they are two sort of, one is an other oriented, one is a self-oriented explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely used to. At first, that is the main way I thought about it, especially with those studies where I was looking at anxiety when people are wanting to punish other people. I was really thinking of it about this sort of internal conflict where people really, it's really distressing for people to harm other people for no reason whatsoever. And then we see people are also viciously punitive and will do horrible things to other people with it, happily. They will experience very intense positive emotion when the right people are being harmed. So I did used to think of it as a kind of resolving the conflict within the self. I'm not saying that's not happening at all. It makes sense to me that is happening a little bit. The reason that I kind of think about it more about justifying your actions to other people is related to partly what you said, which is that one reason we're averse to harming other people is precisely because if we harm other people for no reason, people harm us. They come after us because now we're the villain. That's probably, we shouldn't want to evolve, or we shouldn't want to harm our in-group members because that also harms us, because it can be helpful to have other people on your team. I guess my sense is just the stronger, probably evolutionary force would be toward managing your reputation rather than managing your own internal conflict, because people seem pretty good at having internal conflict. It often doesn't seem to bother them too much. And because the punitive instinct is so powerful, I'm not really sure people have a super strong need to justify it to themselves alone. It's more justifying it to yourself in order to justify it to other people. So I guess what I'm saying is that is how I used to interpret it. Now I think the social side's probably more important. Both might be happening. It's actually a good question. Like, how would you test which one is stronger? I guess one would be doing it in front of other people. Yeah, that would be a good way to do it. So you do a study where people are watching.
Right. So here's, just let me tie this to the example you use, right? So here's a way of looking at the Don Corleone thing, the Godfather case, right? So you use that slide, and the whole point is he doesn't care whether you had any control. He doesn't care whether you did it of your own free will, precisely because he doesn't care about harming people. He has no compunction about harming people. So he has no interest in inflating their autonomy. He doesn't need to inflate it. He doesn't have to feel better about himself. He's already just happy to kill them, right? So that same case, I thought it was interesting because the same thing can be used. So you could describe the exact same case by saying, yeah, but look, he's got to send a message to all the rival bosses. That would be one that's like the error management approach, closer to the error management thing, but there's still this other thing, which is, I don't know if that's a way of getting at how you might test it, right? With characters who just don't, I don't know how I'd have to think about it. But in any event, I'll leave it. The talk was awesome, and I got to think about it. But yeah.
No, I think it's a good question, and I think it's probably something worth testing. One thing is all of my studies are conducted privately. So they're doing it without any concern about being judged, unless they're afraid that I'm the experimenter judging them. So that's something. It would be interesting to see if the effect is larger when there are other people watching, or when you're going to be forced to justify your decision to other people. So do you get a stronger motivated free will attributions or belief or whatever responsibilities effect when you're going to punish a person and then you have to explain yourself to a group of observers?
That's the way. That's the way you do it. Yes, that is definitely.
But what it would do is it would tell you that the social concern is part of it, but it wouldn't tell you that the internal psychological conflict is none of it. So how would you know whether
nice
the
way
internal
of highlighting the social piece? Yeah,
that's true. Yeah.
Anyway, thanks again. That was amazing. Greg had another comment or question.
Only if there's time. If you have a minute.
It looks like you've got the last question anyway, so we'll let that be the last question, and that's fine.
Okay, this is just a small niche thing that you touched on. I thought was really interesting. So you found that free will belief judgments went down in the deterrence condition, which was really cool, right? So it seemed that when they realized that they don't really need free will to justify what they really want to justify, which is this kind of punitive reaction, the belief in free will sort of diminished a little bit. I was wondering what would happen, and this is just a kind of question if you have any intuition on what would happen, and it's a selfish reason. What do you think might happen if they were given articles with a non-punitive alternative? So I'm thinking something like my public health quarantine model, which I think of as not just non-retributive, but non-punitive. I'm wondering if there might be like a backfire effect where they sort of say, well, look, without the belief in free will, I might not be able to justify this kind of punishment or retributive reaction that I want. The deterrence thing sort of gave it to me, but if we don't give them that option, or if we present them with objections to that option and give them a non-punitive alternative, I think that you might get a backfire effect where they get more retributive and double down on belief in free will, but I'm not sure. I mean, do you have an intuition on that?
You mean if you propose, like if you proposed an alternative to like what we would traditionally think of as punishment, would that make them want to punish even more? Is that what you're asking?
What I'm thinking is, it seemed that the reason the belief in free will went down maybe in the deterrence option is they got what they want without free will. They got to preserve punishment, not needing free will. So they sort of said, okay, well, then maybe I'm less likely to commit myself to this belief in free will. But what if they can't get punishment? Like, what if the alternative for dealing with criminals is not punitive, but like some kind of incapacitation account that treats them in ways that, you know, calculate their well-being in a kind of heavy way? Then they
Would
don't
that
get what
make
they want.
Make it rehabilitation, make it even,
Yeah,
I mean, no
yeah.
quarantine, nothing negative. So it's
Yeah.
all about helping the person who did the harm.
Right. So they don't get what they want.
And then,
And then I wonder what would happen to the belief in free will.
Yeah.
Because they might get enough of what they want. So it could go either way. They might get enough of what they want, which is something to some kind of sanctions maybe for the wrongdoer. But they wouldn't get what they really want, which is punitiveness. And so I wonder what would happen to their free will belief in this kind of weird scenario.
So I think so. I think it wouldn't have the backfire effect. I think it would actually have the following effect. In order to view people, Eddie has some research, I think, about this with AL, right? In order to view people as rehabilitatable or even like an apt target of punishment, you have to view them as some way changeable.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a reason Eddie said rehabilitation. I bet if you made it like rehabilitation, rather than if you just gave them like a kind of quarantine without rehabilitation, just like a house them sort of purely preventive approach without the rehabilitation piece, then they might think they're not free because you're just housing them like an animal, not your model, like just a quarantine model traditionally. Whereas the rehab model already has this idea that like they're going to be sensitive to reasons, they're going to understand what's going on, they're going to change their behavior. It's like there's every reason to think that even though it's true they're not going to punish them, but you've still got to attribute agency, a kind of control and agency to them to make the rehabilitation make sense, especially if you're forced to accept that and not punish them. Man, you better think they're going to change, right? Otherwise, it's going to be like aversive. And that's my sense, but who knows?
Yeah, it's interesting.
I have a few reactions to that. One is my gut intuition is that if you did do like a really like empathic rehabilitation, like these people need to be treated well, like they don't need to suffer, depending on what the person did, my sense is that would increase their desire to punish, because that would just go against the sort of natural instinct to want people to suffer when they cause suffering. But I'm not 100% sure. I have thought about part of this pro-blame bias was like a piece of a chapter that I wrote on when would people attribute free will to people. And the hypothesis is that they would attribute to free will to people who can be shaped by moral judgment. So they don't attribute free will to people who are like, they have some kind of cognitive limitation, or they have severe mental illness that affects their ability to have normal human emotions, to children, animals, living creatures that don't have much concern for their moral reputation. So the example that I give, which I have not tested, but someone should test it, I think my intuition is correct, is, have you ever been wronged by like a super drunk person? Like a super drunk person did something really dickish. You get mad at them then, but you really get mad at them the next day when they're sober, because they don't give a shit if you're mad at them when they're drunk. And I think what this shows potentially is that we reserve moral judgment for people who care about the moral judgment and would change as a result of it. So I think this is related to what you were talking about, Thomas, which is, I think actually people would attribute more free will to people who appear changeable, changeable by rehab, but also changeable by me calling you an asshole or socially ostracizing you. And it seems kind of like those don't make sense, because it's almost about the more the person can be controlled, the more free will they have. But I actually think that might be what we would see if we were to test this somehow. I don't know how we would test it.
Thank you.
But someone should do the drunk person experiment. Do you guys share my intuition on that one?
Absolutely.
You think you get mad?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can play the part of the drunk person.
Okay. You can be our drunk confederate.
Anyway, all right. Well, listen, everybody, that was amazing. Thank you, many thank you. That was great. We haven't had any psychologists yet, and your psychology connects to philosophy in a way that I think is amazing. So I was very excited and honored to have you. I'll post a video. I'll post a link on the blog where this stuff is posted. I'll take down some of her stuff on that same post where her information is, and I'll replace it with the link to the recording. So if you want to share it to people who might be interested in it, you can point them that direction later on. And I will see you, I guess not until April. We've got the next talk by Dana Nelkin. And in the meantime, thanks for showing up. And
Greg has his hand raised, or is
Thanks
that an
again.
accident? Oh,
No,
you're
he's pointing to wave.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, and I appreciate all of your thoughts on this. And
Yeah.
some cool
Safe
stuff comes out of it.
travels to Slovenia.
Thank you.
Yeah, be safe.
Nice seeing you. I will.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Ciao.
I'm going to watch the GSU game.